Good morning. Please turn with me to Micah chapter 4 as we look at the subject this morning, the mountain, as you heard in the scripture reading. But let's subtitle it Seth. In a lesson, I'm going to confess right away. I'm trying to dial things in, right? Because I got enough of a problem when I read through a passage trying not to get distracted. But I'm going to confess. My mind's going in 3 different directions this morning. I got the study guide, which may have something to do with this sermon. I got the sermon, which is about the mountain of the Lord, and I got Seth, which is the illustration. And they might all go in a completely different direction. So as I often ask the young people to pray before I get up here, please pray that at least one of these preaches and you're able to take something away with you. Because Seth came to mind for this reason. Hopefully it'll be an illustration of what I see in this passage as the mountain of the Lord that really breaks down into 2 blocks. The one describing the mountain of the Lord like you saw, and those who will assemble there. Part of which being a familiar theme, the remnant. That's one sermon. But it may be illustrated in the life of, the life of Seth. Not so much the Seth of the Bible, but if you've heard me preach at Pullman at all, you know the debate about the greatest basketball player of all time has been settled because that's Steph Curry. Thank you. I see we all agree. So that being settled, the sermon is going to draw from the other Curry, Seth, his little brother. Because Seth has had to understand what it's like to grow up in the footsteps of not only a famous brother, but the greatest of all times. And understanding how Seth has made his family basically appreciate a rare accomplishment, I think we can understand a lot about who is going to be assembling, at least as we have it described in Micah chapter 4, at the mountain of the Lord. Understanding this, I am going to beat up on LeBron a little bit. If you understand that LeBron James has tried real hard to get his son to get some recognition as an NBA player, and it hasn't gone so well. It's not because LeBron James is necessarily to be faulted, but it's the fact that there's some accomplishments in life that are just real difficult. And one of the things we're going to see with the remnant is one of the blessings of being God's people is like we mentioned last week. Just like it's effortless, God willing, under normal circumstances when we're sleeping, for us to just breathe without having to try to breathe. And for our hearts to just beat involuntarily. Likewise, there are some things in life that I can put all my efforts into, and they are simply not going to come to pass unless you got the blessing of the Lord who just makes it effortless. And so what has happened to the Curry family is, in spite of all of their difficulties, some lived out on a public stage, because one of the things you know that with fame and notoriety comes sometimes wealth and recognition, but it also comes with the recognition of the very public failures of your family sometimes. And not long ago, his parents, Seth and Steph's parents, got a divorce. And so that was a difficult thing to live out in front of the nation that you had become famous in front of. But likewise, no matter what has happened to that family and the way that they've had to heal through that circumstance, another thing that's happened, and they've had a very rare accomplishment. They got 2 sons that even if everything ends for both of them today, lived out an exceptional NBA career, each on their own. And Seth, I'm going to argue, had to do it under twice the adversity because he had to come up behind the greatest of all. Did I say that? Okay, I did. With that, the first few verses talking about the mountain. And actually, understand, Don has done a great job for us already, giving us a lesson. So I'm going to try to, if you will forgive me, truncate the lesson. So please accept from me this morning the story of the chapter. So I don't go through reading the whole thing again. So just let me describe it for you. Double check me, and then we'll hopefully let the lesson be yours. What we're going to try to do is a shortened sermon. Good luck with that. All right. Like we said, the 2 sections, the mountain of the Lord and the remnant of the Lord. Out of the mountain of the Lord, what we're going to see are those who are assembled. So we probably should read that part. Why? Because around about the end of verse 1, it's going to say, and peoples shall flow to it. Verse 2, and many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. The first thing to understand about Seth is this. Steph, being the greatest, is not going to matter to Seth if he's not outside working on his game as well. And the reason why that came to mind is I saw a couple of content creators this week who were doing a story on an athlete. And I thought it was odd because they don't do a lot of stories on athletes. But what they said was, in this particular situation, the headline was, "When I lost, my family cheered." And I was like, that's weird. I mean, you know, in life, the reality, we talk about the reality of family. Family's tough. But it was just as bad as the headline said. And after they looked at this clip where this man was on another platform talking about the way his losses ended up producing joy in his family, I saw the look on the face of one of the content creators, just kind of, it was almost poker face, and I was wondering which way it was going. And as he looked, it was almost like he was reliving his own experience. And both of them ended up sharing the same story about how the more successful they got, the tighter their circle had to draw. Because they started realizing that not everyone, we said, what does winning really look like? They got to see the harsh reality through this man's story. Even though they don't cover sports, they understand life and they understand success. And this young athlete's story made a lot of sense to them. What happened with him was, once he started making a little bit of money, he lives not too far away from where I worked overseas. He had family who had expectations that he was going to save the family, even though he was a mid-level athlete. He wasn't making elite money. He wasn't making enough to save everybody. But once they started to realize he wasn't making enough to make their dreams come true, they began to become invested in his failure. And the thing these content creators noticed is they became so bitter that they began to undermine the success of the only one who was actually going to be able to get them to the point they were hoping to, right? And so he was saying that is the difficulty that I've seen that they said in their lives, as both of them were on the same page, lamenting this story they were hearing from this relatively low-key athlete who's talking about how he, out of necessity, not desire, had to draw his circle even more narrowly than he ever thought he would. And understand how that plays out in the life of Seth. Seth is never going to be able to become the Seth we know today if he does not overcome that first hurdle. What we are eventually going to see is the way in which God is calling to his mountain no perfect people. I've said it before. I don't lean into jealousy, but God brings me into places where I'm like, wait a minute, I think I was a little bit jealous there. And so even though Seth's story is one of independent success, let's not pretend that Seth might not have had some difficult days watching Steph low-key become celebrated as, if not everybody agrees he's the greatest player of all time, the greatest shooter of all time. There are not a whole lot of people who are going to debate that with you. While Seth is in, they used to call it the D-League, the developmental league, but that sounded too discouraging, so they started calling it the G-League, because in the hood it's better to be called a G, old school gangster, as opposed to D, developmental. But it's the same thing, not the NBA. And that's where Seth was basically grinding out his early career while his brother was succeeding. Understand how there are a lot of siblings who never make it out of the D-League, or if they do, they never have their own career. And so to a certain degree, Seth had to understand, whether or not he was reading Micah 4 or not, the way in which whatever difficulty he was experiencing while his brother was succeeding wasn't going to help him if he didn't get his jumper right. And so understand with all of us, as God is assembling his people to the mountain of the Lord, there are three things that it's saying, not just his people are doing, but all of these other peoples who are enjoying and rejoicing with Jerusalem. Understand, one of the reasons why I talk about, we'll say from time to time, I can be kind of a stickler on that whole thing about where we or how we esteem Israel. It's one of the things that they had to overcome as nations. He's talking about the Gentiles primarily in this book, right? The remnant's going to come later. That's Israel. But he is basically calling to himself those people who are rejoicing with Israel, right? And instead of being resentful of what's going to happen at the end of this, of the success that God is going to pour on Israel, he is calling those who are willing to rejoice with them because they are then going to share in their success. Understand, he's talking on a national level, but he's talking about relationships, y'all. And that's why he's given us families. See, it's one thing if I can rejoice with my family, but then we together as a family get together and begin to undermine the success of other people that God has called just as much as he has called to us. Understand, he's calling everybody here. But the nations are sorting themselves out as to whether or not they can work together toward a healthy purpose. And that's who he's calling to the mountain of the Lord. He's calling everybody. But it says, many are called, few are. Thank you. You read it. right? And the chosen are typically sorting themselves out. And that's what we're doing. Can we play nice with those that God has called? And that's the litmus test. That's what we see out of Seth. And so one of the things was, once Seth finally made it to the league, one of the great stories was people could talk about how Seth could defend Steph in ways nobody else could, because he grew up playing with the greatest shooter of all time. So he wasn't just out in the NBA court getting whooped. He was out there in the D-League developing his game, not necessarily knowing he would ever get to play against his brother in the league at all, because he understood that if he was going to be successful, God willing, it was going to be both he and Steph rising together. They overcame the hurdle that that young other athlete who was on that podcast lamenting the way he and his family couldn't pull together. They overcame that one hurdle that besets us all. And so there are no perfect people that God's calling. The question is, how are we each going to deal with that gnawing feeling that we get when we see someone else in their season when we're still waiting, hoping for God to answer prayers to bring us into ours? As we keep going. Won't spend a whole lot of time. Let's keep going and talk about the results. So what are the results that God willing, Seth will be able to see? Investing his time wisely into both hopefully building his brother's career and his own, even though he's having to wait for his time to come. Verse 3, there God, it'll say, he shall judge between many peoples, and he shall decide for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Understand that the other thing that they are looking forward to here as the people of Israel is the whole concept of focus. They don't have to divide their attention anymore between the earning and the defending. We talk about it from time to time. Understand, one of the reasons why God is trying to keep us out of days of rebuilding or restoration is because if you look at the story of what it was like when they rebuilt the temple after they came back from the captivity, is there's this famous story about them having tools in one hand and weapons in another, trying to build with divided attention. So understand, when God is asking us to listen to his counsel, he is trying to bring us into places where we can merely focus on winning. Because ultimately, that's part of that effortless part of heaven. He's talking about before heaven, he's going to give you a picture of it. If you will simply allow him to guide you into places where all you have to do is focus on your fig tree, your vine, your fill in the blank. And you no longer have to divide your attention between fighting and building. And so understand, one of the things that we say from time to time, God brings us into those places insofar as we are doing the things he's asking us to do. But if we're not doing the things he's asking us to do, it'll be like you can fight your own battles. I say it all the time. It's a dead horse issue. But life, as soon as we leave these doors, is going to challenge us to get back out into fighting battles God does not have for us. Battles that he's going to say, you want to fight that one? That's yours. But if you want peace, even though it seems like you're going to have utopia here, did he ever promise us that we're going to have? No. But it's the kinds of battles that we're fighting. God simply says, this is not peacetime. I told you last week, I make too much out of winning battles. Once I win a battle, I think the war's over, right? I get my mind fixated on a rest. And God's like, no, buddy, get your good night's sleep because tomorrow morning it's back to it, right? Oh, but if I could just get there instead of the reality that I fill in blanks, God is saying that's for me to fill in. Young fella, I'm not young anymore. Somebody gave me a pass this week. They're like, you're not old yet. Thank you. I appreciate the vote of confidence. However, I'm stuck in a place where I feel like I'm old enough, but I'm still not as accomplished in the lessons that I think I should have learned by now. And so I would love the part where I've gained the maturity of what my years suggest I should have, but I say it to you because I have the same struggle when I go outside of those doors. Dividing my attention between the things that God has called me to focus on and the things that it's just so tempting to get wrapped up into, right? But when doing that, one of the things I lose is, he says, the peace that surpasses all understanding. It's because he gives me the opportunity within difficult circumstances to have an inexplicable peace, a peace that makes no sense because it comes from him. If we go back to the flip side of the study guide we had last week that talks about Ecclesiastes, we saw that the same person, the same act could have completely two different results depending upon the individual experiencing it. Some people can find tremendous satisfaction out of a simple day of work, when others, sometimes, I don't have a whole lot of folks bothering me, but it can just be tedious some days. Sometimes it can be the same person with two different experiences. And Solomon noticed over the course of his life that it was God that was adding a blessing to the workday, that was allowing a person to do the same work and have a completely different experience. Likewise, accomplishments. The same accomplishments that meant nothing to someone who was either going home to turmoil or still had something going on in their life that just did not let them have peace would bring an unusual amount of satisfaction to the other person. Because God was adding a blessing to the exact same thing, which made it have a completely different meaning. And then he got down to the simple things, food and drink. He's like, one person can have a 12 course. How many courses go into a good meal? I don't know. He said, you can have all that. Our sister's been studying cooking. That's right. She knows all of them, right? You can have all those courses set out before you, and it can mean absolutely nothing. God can take you over to Albertsons. I don't want to plug it. And pick your own store. Have you get one of them pre-made cakes. Go home, skip Sunday dinner, and just be ecstatic over pre-made cake. If God drops a blessing on your afternoon of pre-made cake, right? And that was the wisdom of Solomon. Before he gets to the end of the matter, serve God and keep his commandments, there was some depth that we're missing if we're missing the point that God is the one who is adding a blessing to whatever it is we're doing. And that's what the people of Israel seem to be learning now. That's the value of coming to the mountain of the Lord. Because they realize we tried it all on our own. I can go here. I can go there. I appreciate God for giving me enough leash to do it my way. Because now I'm ready to hear what he has to say. Because my way, as Sister Linda has given us the wisdom to understand, a quote I steal often, has not turned out the way I thought it would. And I know there's something. I know one of my friends back when I was a baby preacher, and he was like, Marcus, I ask you a question. I don't remember what the question was, but I remember he just said, I just know he had 3, 4 kids. I don't remember how many kids. But he says, I grew up close to God, but wasn't really steeped in God as he was raising his kids. And he's an amazing man. But he said, Marcus, I just know I could have done better. And so when I hear somebody who says that, that's one of the reasons why I fully believe we stayed friends all these years. Brother, it's candid. He knows he could have done better. And I think because he was bringing it up to me as baby preacher who didn't have any help for him right now, I think what he was saying is he knows he could have done better with God or with more God in the upbringing of those young people. And so as we're talking about that, we're talking about the way in which the peoples are finally getting to that point where they realize they can do better, and therefore they are assembling to a place where God is making their accomplishments, no matter how simple, have value. As we continue, he's going to talk about the remnant, focusing on his people, verse 6. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away, and those whom I have afflicted. And the lame will make the remnant. Wait, who's the remnant? No, the remnant are the elites. They're Steph and Seth. And no, he's literally saying he's going to make the lame the remnant. And who else? And those who were cast off, a strong nation. He's not assembling perfect people. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time forth and forevermore. Going back to the story I told not too long ago. I heard a little bit more of it recently. It's NBA day, y'all. Sorry. I lived in Minnesota for a while, but it was before a young man by the name of Jimmy Butler was the star player there. And so there was a story where he was in a contract dispute. I didn't even know the backstory until I heard it this week. One of his teammates finally came out and told the story. They were not paid. He was one of the, higher paid players on the team, but he wasn't the highest. And he was kind of tired of being in that situation. Sometimes it sounds petty, but sometimes you just want to, be treated at least according to what you're kind of contributing. And so instead of yelling, Jimmy Butler walked into practice one day and said, I want to scrimmage. And it was a problem because he had sat out, they said, camp. And so he hadn't shown up for any of the stuff he was supposed to do to get the play that day. But he's like, I'm going to get the play. So the coach said he could play. And so he put him in with the starters. He's like, nope, I don't want them. He's like, I want them. And he picked all the guys who, if you know how preseason works, not everybody who gets a chance to make the team makes the team. And so he said he went and he took all the guys who weren't going to make the team, and he absolutely worked the starters to prove a point. It's like, you don't have to give me credit for what I'm worth, but understand. He said he got it. And the whole point was, Jimmy Butler, regardless of what he was worth, understood that there was still value in the leftover guys who were going to end up in the Seth League, the developmental league. And so he couldn't have made that point if he didn't see the value in cast-off talent. Because you can make the point with the starters, but they're the starters. He understood the value in those who are typically cast aside, and that's literally what God is talking about here. He is not talking about picking up his favorite 5, as I use as an illustration from time to time. He's talking about the leftovers. And if I can't aspire to anything else, I can relate to being leftover, right? And so stories like this give me hope. All he's saying is, Marcus, we talk about motives. What do you really want out of life? Do you want me to make the most out of your talent, Seth? Or are you like that other situation where you're wishing you were Steph so much that you can't make the most out of the gym time I'm giving you? And so even if I'm a leftover, if I'm willing to make the most out of the time he has given me, he's saying I am still wanted just as much as Steph. And so that is one of the things that gives me encouragement about this particular passage. He's assembling the leftovers. He has Jimmy Butler wisdom. No matter what you might think about Jimmy, it took a lot of wisdom to make that point that way. And so likewise, maybe there's a little bit of biblical understanding in those kinds of decisions, especially if we got people who are of the world who understand that there's a lot of value in the leftovers. We're serving a God who realizes there's a lot of value in the leftovers. As verse 8 continues, and you, O tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you shall it come. The former dominion shall come. Kingship for the daughter of Jerusalem. This is another point we make from time to time. He is not simply calling us to hold our heads down forever. Because understand, part of the reason why they are the remnant is because of sins they've committed and wrongs they've done. These aren't life circumstances. We talk about the ways in which life leads us into some disappointing places. Sometimes it's circumstance, sometimes it's choices. These are the remnant that are made because of bad choices. And he's still not throwing them away. And he's not bringing them back to a forever place of holding your head, sit down there, and always remember what you've done. I'll let you back, but read it with me again. The former dominion shall come. He is saying that when you assemble at the mountain, he does not simply bring you back to remind you that you're less than he is. He's God, but he wants you to fulfill your potential, the potential you had before the mistakes became a thing. The potential that you had before the shame of your mistakes set in. Why? Because their shame is going to be a part of the story too. Verse 9. Now, why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? The answer is no. Has your counselor perished? That pain that seized you like a woman in labor. Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. Verse 11 is where I want to focus. Now, many nations are assembled against you, saying, let her be defiled, and let our eyes gaze upon Zion. That's part of the worst part of making mistakes, is proving your enemies right. We talk about it from time to time, right? It's one thing if they're just making stuff up. Oh, but it's a whole nother thing when the stuff they're making up is on video. There it went viral. There it is, right? It's another thing when the evidence is coming out of me. And so that's another level of shame. And so that's the shame that they're dealing with. This isn't like, oh, God's people, just the enemies of the Lord just overcame God. Now, surprise, surprise, God took an L. No. God promised them from the time he brought them out of Egypt that if they made certain mistakes, those mistakes were going to lead to open humiliation. And that's where they are right now. And so understand that as he is once again promising to bring them back from open humiliation, he is telling them, like we use the illustration of Seth, there is, of course, a certain level of shame that goes into playing in the D League, right? The G League, whatever you want to call it, it ain't the NBA. And so likewise, in life, there are going to be times in life where you're going to have to deal with the shame of openly being in a position that's just less than what you know your potential is, just inside. You know I can do better than this. And sometimes it's going to be because it's the mistakes you've made that have basically caused you to have to recover. Like we said, it's so much easier when it's just circumstance. I'm just growing. I'm just not as talented as Steph. But then there are other times when I'm not as talented and I made these horrible decisions that have me in this circumstance. Understand, God is basically saying, don't allow, we got a chance to talk about in the young adults class, don't allow yourself to be overcome by your reputation, no matter how you either earned it or how it was put on you, right? Because there's a difference between what we see here, reputation, and what we'll see in the last few verses, which are legacy. Legacy is more important than reputation, as hard as it can be to deal with a reputation or a bad reputation once you've gotten it. Verse 12, but they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan, that he has gathered them as sheaves to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion. For I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hooves bronze. You shall beat to pieces many peoples, and shall devote their gain to the Lord, their wealth to the Lord of the whole earth. And it's one thing if we're talking about money, but as Brother Don said, it is beyond money. What are we doing with our lives? Because ultimately, when we're talking about God's remnant, we're not talking about all Israel. We're talking about the people who have survived the judgment. If you talk about sifting, I started making matcha tea not too long ago, probably about 4 years ago, but I didn't start really understanding how it's supposed to be made until somebody made it right for me on a trip home one time, about 2 years ago. It's like, why am I always getting all these clumps in my tea? I'm eating half of it because, if you know, matcha tea is the tea where you ground up the leaf as opposed to filtering the leaf. And so it's basically the powder. And if you don't filter it right, you'll be drinking clumps, and they don't taste good because they're real bitter unless they're properly mixed and made into the tea, the latte, whatever you want to make. And so I was drinking clumps for about 2 years before I walk into this store. I've told this story before. Just the average supermarket was kind of like a Starbucks stand, except it was their own little coffee place. And I said, matcha tea, please. Low sugar. And she looks at me weird, and she's like, okay. She goes, because I'd never had it made right. Everywhere else I go, they got the pre-mixed powder. It's extra sweet. I got to try to dilute it. She made the most perfect matcha tea I've had in my life. And I was like, oh, this is what it's supposed to be like. So much so that I went back to, like I said, every now and again, life drives me back to the internet. Drove me back to the internet to figure out what was I doing wrong. And then I realized I wasn't properly filtering out the clumps. Because the way it's naturally made, it clumps together. And if you don't have the right stuff, you can't just whip it together like instant coffee, Marcus. That doesn't work. Right? But I took my instant coffee know-how to matcha tea and made a mess till I learned better. That's right. And in a lot of ways, that is the lesson of what God is doing here. Not everybody from Israel is going to make it through. But he is filtering them to the point where he's getting the clumps out. He is filtering them down to the people who, by the time his son comes to talk about this concept of discipleship, are living the kind of lives that he would want his people to pattern their lives after. Our brother was talking about the next generation, right? As the young people are assembled here, understand what we're seeing at the mountain of the Lord. He is filtering his own people, Israel, down to those who he is not ashamed to have others walk after and emulate. And so that is what we're seeing in the life of Steph. The blessing of having a great older brother is, I'm pretty sure Steph wasn't rubbing it in Seth's face every time Seth failed. Because he knows that's going to make it harder for his brother. He realizes that if his family wins, he wins. And so it's not just Seth trying to crawl his way up out of the D-League. I'm sure it has everything to do with an older brother who, if you've heard of his teammates, even folks don't like him, say he's an exceptional teammate. And it sounds like he was an exceptional brother as well. Because here's the lesson. Unless God is adding a blessing to the success of that family, they can go the way of all the other families that tried to have just one basketball player's kid make it. It's rare. Klay Thompson, one of his teammates, it was one of those rare duos. You had two kids on the same team raised by an NBA parent. But the thing to understand comes from the very last portion of the verse. It goes back to Ecclesiastes in verse 13. Who is actually providing their success? For I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hooves bronze. And I will submit to you, I can't say God is blessing Steph Not LeBron. I don't know how God works, even though he's blessing Steph. And no, I'm joking, right? But Steph being the greatest aside, it is an illustration of a life principle. I can pull all the strings I want to. I can call in all the favors I can get. I can get my kid on the team. But if God does not add a blessing to his presence, there is no Seth, right? There's not even a Steph. And they are helping us to understand as two brothers who have accomplished a very rare thing that we're also getting to see in comparison to with the James brothers. It's not all lost for the James brothers. That little brother that they got coming up next is what we call the truth. And so LeBron James might yet have an NBA star in his family because their daddy is LeBron James. And okay, they're pretty good ball players. But understand, none of us are going to have the fullness of success that we might otherwise have if God does not add a blessing to what it is that we're doing. And that is the story of Seth. Well, it reminded me of not just that, but another story where I'll try to close with this one, especially since it's time. But I had a chance to work with some players, NBA players, not NBA players, players who were, pretty good college prospects. I got a chance to work with them when they were in high school. And I didn't get to work with them because I was a great athlete. I worked with them because I was a failed athlete. Meaning, we need you to talk to people who aren't going to make it so you can understand what it's like to have a normal job. And so that was my role, right? Played a little bit of sports, but not enough to make it pro in anything. So I was once your sports career, you got it, okay. And so, but a lot of these kids actually did get to make it. And some of them, they didn't necessarily make it in the league, but they made it. One of them I'm thinking about, what I want to tell you about is he made it overseas. And he had a nice life for himself playing ball over in Europe, right? But I got a chance to see him play against two guys who ended up making it to the NBA. One I got a chance to see when he was literally the highest rated player, single player in high school in the nation. Ended up becoming Rookie of the Year. His career did not pan out. But this relatively unknown kid from Minnesota had to play defense on this kid. Not the least bit afraid. Almost, I won't say he locked him up as we say it, but he did a really good job of playing defense on this number one prospect. Well, the fortunate thing was that kid also made it to the national tournament that year. And he ended up playing another kid, I'll give you his name, by the name of Jimmer Fredette, if you remember Jimmer Fredette. And I didn't know who Jimmer Fredette was. He played for BYU. He didn't make it very well in the league either. But he was an exceptional player. And how did I know? Because he almost, I don't want to say roasted because I love this kid, he roasted the young man I mentored for a while. Couldn't do a thing with this talent. And so that was my measuring stick. I realized how good this young man, Jimmer Fredette, was coming out of BYU because I've seen this kid play against NBA talent. And he struggled that day. And it helped me realize you wouldn't recognize any of these young men's names because they had a short career, relatively, before they had to learn to move on to do other things. I use that as an example for I've seen some unbelievably talented people who ended up living beneath their potential. And there is no shame in it. Because even former NBA players will tell you it's not all about talent. There are people who deserve to be there who never made it. But here's the thing about potential. The one thing that I never want to do with my potential is have it wasted because of choices that I made. And so I understand one of the things that story helped me to understand is that young man who never, like those other two young men I told you about, they both made it to the NBA. My friend never did. But he has a really happy life right now. Having played ball overseas his entire life. He's like the Seth who never made it to the league. But understand in your life, you have not failed if you never make it to the highest levels of what it is your heart is set on making it to. If God adds a blessing to your time overseas playing in Europe, right? And that's the lesson of this story. There's only room for so many greatest of all times. But there's a lot of happiness that can be had in life in the ranks below the elite. And so one of the things that this story reminded me of is the way in which, like we mentioned, God is drawing us all to a level of completeness, a level of joy that he can turn, like he said, when Christ was coming into his triumphant entry, they were saying, shh, make them silent. Make them stop yelling, Hosanna. He said, if they stop yelling, the rocks in the trees are going to cry out. Because God will produce praise from anything. And so even if you never reach what it is that you feel you have the potential to reach, God can bring out praise and joy in your life out of a little Sunday afternoon bundt cake. And so with that, one of the reasons, once again, why there is so much value in simply doing the things that God has asked us to do is I pray for you, bundt cake. Not that that's all you have for Sunday dinner, but no matter how much you are deprived in life, you are living the kind of life that God wants to fill with joy based upon rocks in the trees abundance. So that when he brings you, Seth, into the league, it's just that much more of a blessing. But if you never make it to the league, you're still happy and you're still blessed, not only yourself, but those who, as our brother Don said, are going to be coming behind you. Because I guarantee you, Steph and Seth and that whole family are going to be made super happy if their careers end tomorrow and them grandkids end up doing well in life, never having played a day in the league. And so if nothing else, God, please bless us to overcome the pitfalls and the distractions that keep us from being able to be content and find joy in even the simplest things in life as we together stand and sing.